The village of Saint-Martin rested quietly in the Loire Valley, far removed from the thunder of military campaigns and the strategic crossroads that invited devastation. Distance from the war's machinery bred a dangerous illusion among its inhabitants, the hope that occupation, if it arrived at all, would touch them lightly. That hope, as it turned out, became more lethal than hunger, more destructive than any weapon the soldiers would bring. When the Germans arrived in June of 1940, following France's catastrophic defeat at Sedan after merely 6 weeks of fighting, they came not as conquerors bent on immediate destruction, but as tourists surveying unfamiliar terrain. Young soldiers on motorcycles and in military trucks rolled through the countryside with cheerful expressions, seemingly unburdened by the weight of occupation. The French men of military age had already scattered thousands of kilometers to the south in desperate flight, or confined behind the wire of prisoner-of-war camps, where bread and water constituted the entirety of their sustenance. What remained in Saint-Martin was a village stripped of its protectors. Women of various ages, elderly men whose wars belonged to previous generations, invalids bearing the scars of old conflicts, and a handful of young men deemed too ill or defective for military service, these became the population left to navigate the occupation's treacherous waters. Before we continue, we invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your support enables us to bring you more deeply researched narratives of history's forgotten voices and overlooked struggles. Now, back to the story. Margot Dupont had reached the age of 32 when German boots first pressed into the soil of her village. Her husband Pierre had served with a motorcycle regiment, caught in the terrible maelstrom at Dunkirk, where thousands of French soldiers fell or vanished into captivity. Whether he breathed still or lay decomposing in some distant field remained unknowable. Letters never arrived. The Red Cross possessed no information. The shattered French army had no resources to track individual fates. Margot existed in a purgatory worse than death itself, for death at least provided finality, an answer to the question that gnawed at her every waking moment. She possessed 3 hectares of land, a house crowned with tile roofing, an extensive vegetable garden, and several goats. Before the occupation descended, this modest estate represented sufficiency for a French peasant woman, enough to feed herself, shelter herself, and maintain a measure of prosperity. The occupation transformed these assets into objects of military interest. The commanding officer, a young man named Geldon, selected her dwelling as headquarters for the Occupation Administration Office. Geography had betrayed her. The first order arrived with crystalline clarity. She would remain on the property, but confined to a private section, a kitchen, a single bedroom with 1 window, nothing more. The remainder of her home, the portions with abundant light and views of the road, now belonged to the Wehrmacht. The Germans required provisions. The village received instructions to deliver specific quantities of grain, meat, milk, and vegetables each week, calculated with meticulous precision by logistical experts operating from Berlin offices. These bureaucrats crafted formulas of deliberate cruelty arithmetic, designed to ensure the village would not literally starve to death, but would exist perpetually on the razor's edge between survival and collapse, constantly hungry, constantly depleted, constantly aware of their fragility. Margot began smuggling, as did every peasant woman with the will to resist starvation. She concealed grain beneath the floorboards of her bedroom. She buried potatoes in the forest near the river. She submerged eggs in an iron container beneath the water's surface where German searches would not penetrate. The risk was absolute confiscation of all possessions for the first offense, execution for the second. Yet people engaged in this deadly game regardless, because slow starvation promised a more certain death than a bullet's quick mercy. But Margot committed an act that transcended mere smuggling. She became involved with a German officer. His name was Klaus Weber, 28 years old, a native of Dusseldorf, son of a banker who could trace Prussian lineage through generations. He possessed the kind of cold, aristocratic handsomeness that made him appear as a mannequin dressed in military finery. His face seemed molded into a permanent expression of authority, emotionless, impenetrable, perfectly controlled. He had arrived in the village as a junior officer with explicit instructions from his command. Instill profound respect for the occupying authorities among the local population. minimize resistance, transform the occupation into a smoothly functioning machine of efficiency. Margot did not want him. She had no choice in the matter. When he began entering her private bedroom at night, closing the door with the quiet deliberation of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary duty, when he looked at her with those cold blue eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts, she understood that silence was her only option. Resistance meant death, not just her own, but collective punishment for the entire village. Resistance meant deportation to camps from which few returned. The first encounter resembled a surgical procedure executed in a hospital, efficient, cold, devoid of passion or any gesture that extended beyond pure mechanics. He performed his task with Prussian precision. He dressed himself in one smooth motion and departed the room without looking back at her. She lay in the darkness waiting for the bleeding to cease, for her breathing to normalize, for the sensation of humanity to return to her body. But he came back, again and again, once weekly at first, then twice weekly, then more frequently. He brought provisions from Germany, canned goods, sausage, real chocolate, hard candies, commodities the French population had long forgotten existed. This was his method of communicating, in a language requiring no words, that what transpired between them was not rape but transaction, food exchanged for flesh. Commerce in humanity's oldest form, Margot accepted these provisions and redistributed them throughout the village under cover of darkness. The elderly received larger portions because their bodies succumbed to hunger more readily. Widows with children received enough to prevent their starvation in the streets. Mothers nursing infants received sufficient supplies to produce milk for their babies. This pattern of distribution transformed Margot into a heroine, in certain eyes a peasant woman who sacrificed her body for the survival of her community. But it simultaneously marked her as a prostitute in the judgment of those who possessed no compassion for choices made under duress. The occupation stretched across years like tar in winter cold, like time that refused its natural forward progression. Margot received no confirmation regarding her husband Pierre's fate. She waited for letters that never materialized. She inquired with various authorities who possessed either no information or no willingness to share what they knew. But she discovered with absolute certainty that she carried Klaus Weber's child. She had attempted every abortion method known to village peasant women. She consumed wormwood tinctures provided by elderly women with knowledge of such matters. She threw herself down the stairs of her bedroom. She inserted various objects internally, wooden implements, metal instruments. Nothing succeeded. Her body remained determined to produce this infant. The boy arrived in January of 1943, born on a frozen night when the Loire River had transformed into solid ice. He possessed his father's blue eyes, his golden hair, his distinctly Prussian features. He existed as living evidence of collaboration, a physical manifestation of what she had done to survive. The village learned of the birth. The village understood its implications. Margot became known as a horizontal collaborator, a woman who had lain with an occupier, who had birthed an occupier's child, a woman who would eventually face reckoning for these acts. When Klaus transferred to another unit in March of 1944, the Occupation Administration issued an order his child would be raised in Germany in a specialized orphanage for children of mixed descent who possessed sufficient genetic quality to integrate into the German racial hierarchy. Margot did what women throughout occupied France, Norway, the Netherlands, and every conquered territory did when faced with such orders. She fled with the child into the forest, seeking refuge among the trees and hidden places where military authority could not immediately reach. 2 weeks later, officers located them in the forest where she had been sheltering in an old structure that nomadic peoples had once used for seasonal habitation. 2 weeks after that discovery, the child was removed from her arms, placed on a train, and sent northeast to Germany, to a destination whose name Margot never learned. She watched her son disappear beyond the horizon and waited for death to claim her as punishment. But they did not kill her. They left her alive to suffer, to exist with the knowledge of her actions, to serve as a warning to other peasant women about the consequences of sleeping with occupiers. When liberation finally arrived in August of 1944, when American tanks rolled into the village with soldiers singing and smiling, the occupation's formal structure collapsed. Commandant Geldon shot himself in his office in the final hours before the Americans entered Saint-Martin, placing a pistol to his temple. His orderly discovered his body the following morning. The village celebrated its freedom, and then the revenge began, justice and cruelty intertwined like threads in history's tapestry. Margot, who had received chocolate and canned provisions from an officer who had distributed food throughout the village to prevent collective starvation, was publicly identified as a collaborator, a woman who had purchased survival with her body. Young men returning from camps and battlefronts seized her in the village square and cut off her hair amid her screams and tears, transforming her humiliation into public entertainment. They smeared her face with soot. They painted slurs across her clothing, declaring her a traitor who had slept with the enemy. Her husband Pierre stood among those who had returned from captivity. He watched in silence, unable to determine whether she had acted from love for him or pure self-preservation, whether she had become someone entirely different or remained the woman he had married. He departed the village without speaking to her. Margot remained a woman without honor, without husband, without the child who had been stolen from her arms. She continued living in Saint-Martin for another 40 years, existing in a state of perpetual apology for what she had experienced, for what she had done to survive. People regarded her as a ghost, a woman whom history had designated as simultaneously victim and accomplice. The village of St. Martin recovered physically over the subsequent years. Houses underwent reconstruction. The church was cleaned of blood and chaos. Fields received new crops. People returned to their occupations and daily routines. But the village's soul remained trapped in the occupation, imprisoned in the dark spaces where people had made choices from which no return was possible. The community never forgot what its women had been forced to endure. They never forgot the collaboration that had begun with hunger and concluded with the complete destruction of honor. Margot's story stands as testament to the impossible choices imposed by occupation, to the brutal mathematics of survival under totalitarian control, to the cruel irony that saying no was never truly an option, and that saying yes condemned her to a lifetime of judgment from those who would never understand the weight of her decision. In the end, she survived the war but lost everything that made survival meaningful: her child, her husband, her dignity, her place in the community she had tried desperately to help feed. The occupation's cruelest joke was this: by doing what she believed necessary to keep others alive, she sentenced herself to a death that lasted decades, a social execution that denied her the mercy of a quick end. If this story of impossible choices and their consequences moved you, please subscribe for more deeply researched narratives of human struggle during humanity's darkest chapters. Thank you for watching.